Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. This is our first lecture of the spring season. My name is Anouar Majid. I'm the director of the center. And this is our 8th year of programming. And so I'm really delighted to see this kind of attendance in a very cold day and also in interesting times. So the title is Food and Identity in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we are very delighted to have David Freidenreich as our guest speaker tonight. He is the Pulver Family Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Colby College, where he serves as Director of the Jewish Studies Program and Associate Director of the Center for Small Town Jewish Life. After receiving a BA from Brandeis University, he earned his PhD at Columbia University and rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. His award-winning first book, Foreigners and Their Food, Constructing Otherness in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Law, explores attitudes towards adherents of foreign religions expressed in ancient and medieval laws about sharing food. He is currently studying the ways Christians have used ideas about Jews to think about Muslims. So please help me welcome David to the podium.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Special thanks to Anouar for this wonderful invitation and to the Center for Global Humanities for offering this kind of programming to the people of Portland and the state of Maine. We really need as many opportunities as possible to come together, to learn from one another, and to engage in conversation. A priest, a minister, and a rabbi walk into a bar. The bartender says, "What is this, a joke?" Complete the joke however you'd like. The punchline that interests me is already present in the setup. Priest, minister, rabbi jokes are cliches in contemporary American culture, and there's nothing especially surprising or funny about the fact that these members of the clergy would walk into a bar together. The punchline comes as that scenario unfolds. Until recently, however, the scenario itself would have been inconceivable for a host of reasons. My remarks focus on one of those reasons, namely the bar. But let me change the venue from a bar to a restaurant so that an imam can join in on our joke. If our religious figures adhered to all of the dietary restrictions found in the medieval sources of their respective traditions, their efforts to go out for dinner might prove quite comic, or perhaps a better word would be tragic. The imam, if a Sunni, would have no difficulty. If he didn't want to simply order vegetarian food, he could make a case for eating most meat dishes served at this Christian-operated restaurant. A Shi'i, however, might find himself eating an undressed salad at his own table. The rabbi would likely order a salad as well, although for different reasons than his Shi'i counterpart. The two Christians might be willing to eat everything on the menu, but only if the cooks aren't Jewish. Like the Shi'i, the Christians would also demand their own table, or perhaps two separate tables, one for the Catholic and one for the Protestant. Under such circumstances, it's quite unlikely that these members of diverse religious communities would bother walking into a restaurant together in the first place. That's precisely the point of certain kinds of religious food restrictions. We commonly think of dietary laws as relating to ingredients, pork, for example, or alcohol. Jewish, Islamic, and even Christian sources from antiquity and the Middle Ages also contain rules based not on what's in the food, but on who makes it or who shares it. Modern analogies to these rules include racially segregated lunch counters and middle school cafeteria cliques. We've all experienced the close bonds that form through eating together. Refusal to share a meal or to accept food prepared by someone else conveys powerfully the message that the divide between us and them ought not be bridged. We shouldn't become close with them, and we shouldn't internalize any of their undesirable attributes either. Not only that, antisocial behavior of this nature subtly reinforces stereotyped ideas about who they are, and more importantly, who we are. Some American supporters of the 2003 Iraq War, for example, refused to eat foods associated with the French, who opposed the war. How many people here remember freedom fries? The calorie count stayed the same, but the Republicans who insisted on removing French fries from the menu of congressional cafeterias recognized that only freedom fries bolster the kind of American identity that lends itself to support of regime change through military intervention. So, what kind of identity is bolstered by keeping kosher, or by eating only halal ingredients, or by consuming traditionally Christian foods? There's no single answer to questions like these, because the nature and significance of Jewish, Islamic, and Christian food practices have shifted over time in various ways. Over the next hour, we'll explore the evolution of Jewish dietary laws and the conceptions of Jewish identity they convey. We'll then look at food restrictions found in Christian and Islamic sources. Here, too, we'll focus on how rules about food reflect ideas about members of other religions, and how these ideas, in turn, reflect the identity of medieval Christians and Muslims. Finally, we'll examine contemporary food practices and the ways ideas about us and them play out in religious communities today. How we eat, after all, still reflects how we think about ourselves and those around us. Don't worry, I'll leave plenty of time for your questions as well. Before diving in, I should be clear that my remarks will focus primarily on rules about food rather than the actual practices of average Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Why? In part because data regarding the food practices of ancient and medieval commoners is hard to come by, while rules were written down in sacred books preserved from generation to generation. Although these rules had only a limited impact on the broader society, they had a lasting effect within their religious communities because they helped to form the identities of everyone who studied them. Laws express and shape both the aspirations and the fears of their authors and interpreters, which makes them especially valuable as a barometer of attitudes regarding us and them. I will note parenthetically that that sentence applies to executive actions no less than other forms of laws. Laws express and shape both the aspirations and the fears of their authors and interpreters, which makes them especially valuable as a barometer of attitudes regarding us and them. The rabbi in our imaginary restaurant would order a salad in part because other foods on the menu might contain ingredients forbidden in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Keeping kosher, in other words, is a way to express one's Jewishness, defined in this respect as adherence to the Torah's instructions. Many have suggested that the purpose of keeping kosher is to keep Jews separate from non-Jews. It's actually not that simple. In fact, the dietary laws found in the Hebrew Bible would have done a lousy job of separating ancient Israelites from their Canaanite neighbors. These laws relate exclusively to meat, which most people in the land of Israel could only afford to eat a few times a year. Archaeological evidence also indicates that the vast majority of meat consumed in the region was permissible according to biblical law. Canaanites, it turns out, didn't eat pork either. The Torah, the portion of the Hebrew Bible also known as the Pentateuch, does single out pork as forbidden meat. It uses the same language, however, to single out the meat of rock badgers, a guinea pig-like animal that lives in craggy desert regions and surely wasn't consumed by humans on a regular basis. The reason why pigs and rock badgers are specifically identified as forbidden is simply that they each possess one, but not both, of the required criteria for permitted land animals. In short, there probably wasn't much of a difference between the diets of Israelites and Canaanites. So keeping kosher didn't set Israelites apart from their neighbors. The Torah, in fact, doesn't aspire for Israelites to eat differently from their neighbors, but rather, you might say, to eat similarly to God. Kosher animals are those that resemble animals fit for sacrifice in the temple. So those who keep kosher affirm their membership in what the Bible describes as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. More fundamentally, the Torah portrays the Israelites' act of distinguishing between kosher and non-kosher food as being parallel to the divine act of distinguishing between Israelites and everyone else. The Bible scholar Jacob Milgram put it this way: as God has restricted his choice of the nations to Israel, so must Israel restrict its choice of edible animals to the few sanctioned by God. The practice of selecting and preparing one's meat in accordance with God's laws reinforces in Israelites a sense of uniqueness, even if the choices Israelites make aren't actually different from those of their neighbors. Like the Americans who insisted on eating freedom fries instead of French fries, Israelites ingested the same meat as their Canaanite neighbors, but also internalized a particular way of viewing themselves and their world. By keeping kosher, Israelites affirmed their status as holy, that is, distinctive, set apart by God from all other peoples to live in a godlike manner. Doing so, however, didn't require Israelites to avoid sharing meals with other people. Of course, Judaism of the Middle Ages and today is not the religion of the Bible, and that was already true more than 2,000 years ago. Jewish practices, Jewish values, and even Jewish identity evolved as Jews absorbed new ideas from their ever-changing surroundings. A number of particularly significant changes occurred during the Hellenistic period, when Greeks ruled the Eastern Mediterranean. Following the conquests of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, the land of Israel became home to a large number of pork-loving Greeks. Suddenly, keeping kosher really did mark Jews as different from the surrounding society. Even Jews who resisted assimilation, however, internalized many aspects of Greek thought and culture during the Hellenistic period. So, for example, Jews in the Greek city of Alexandria interpreted biblical dietary laws in light of virtues promoted by Greek philosophers. Keeping kosher, these philosophically inclined Jews declared, keeps Jews morally upright by promoting virtues such as cleanliness and righteousness, while discouraging vices like violence and promiscuity. To paraphrase, by forbidding pork, the Torah prevents its adherents from acting like pigs. No rationale of this sort appears within biblical accounts of dietary laws, which explain these rules in terms of holiness, not morality. Another Hellenistic concept embraced by these Jews relates to the distinction between us and them. Greek thinkers divided the world into two groups, Greeks and barbarians, and they largely ignored the differences among foreigners. So too, Jewish thinkers of this era began to classify all non-Jews as Gentiles, plain and simple. Specifically, Jewish food practices began to function as a means of distinguishing Jews from Gentiles. Hellenistic Jews used stories about food to express their ideas regarding the ideal relationship between being Jewish and interacting with the dominant Greek society. Biblical heroes from Abraham to Esther share meals with foreigners in a completely nonchalant fashion. The identity of the dining partners is simply irrelevant to the plot. In Alexandria, however, Jews told stories of heroes who insist on keeping kosher, but who nevertheless earn the respect of Gentile kings and even share kosher meals with these kings. These fictional meals reflect both the storyteller's commitment to preserving their Jewish distinctiveness and the acceptance within Hellenistic society to which these Alexandrian Jewish storytellers nonetheless aspire. At the same time, Jews in Jerusalem and the surrounding region of Judea began telling stories about heroes who not only keep kosher, but also abstain from all food prepared by non-Jews. The prophet Daniel, for example, refuses to eat food provided to him by a Gentile king, even though earlier biblical figures ate such food. In another tale, Judith's refusal to eat food prepared by Gentiles enables her to save the Jewish people from certain destruction. It's all about the food. Separate from the Gentiles and do not eat with them, Abraham warns Jacob in a third Judean story, expressing a norm that would have been unrecognizable to the authors of Genesis. Jewishness, according to these Judean storytellers, entails self-segregation from Gentiles. For Jews in the Hellenistic world, keeping kosher was not just about the ingredients of one's food, but also about who prepares it and who shares it. These food practices preserve a distinctive Jewish identity by marking Jews as different from their Gentile neighbors, whether or not they eat together. It's no coincidence that this development in the function of Jewish food norms occurs during the Hellenistic era, when members of minority groups could literally become Greek through a process of enculturation that included the adoption of Hellenistic food practices. Rabbinic Judaism, the variety of Judaism that's been dominant for the past 1,500 years, emerged in Judea during the first centuries of the Common Era. As Judean, rather than Alexandrian Jews, the rabbis took for granted their community's norms forbidding food prepared by Gentiles. As scholars obsessed with categories and principles, the rabbis of the 2nd through 6th centuries transformed these norms into a laundry list of specific rules, all grounded in notions of what it means to be Jewish. Some of these rules, like the prohibition against eating finely minced fish prepared by Gentiles, addresses the fact that Gentiles might use non-kosher ingredients. We, as Jews, follow the Torah's commandments. They, the Gentiles, do not. Other rules, like the prohibition against drinking wine made or even touched by Gentiles, reflect concern that Gentiles regularly offer idolatrous wine libations. We worship the one true God, while they are all polytheists. In addition, rabbinic law prohibits eating bread baked by Gentiles, cheese made by Gentiles, the meat of animals slaughtered by Gentiles, or food cooked by Gentiles. The common denominator here is that all of these foods are transformed during their preparation process. Bread, after all, doesn't grow on trees. Similarly, it takes a butcher to turn a cow into beef. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss famously distinguished between the raw and the cooked, that is, natural and cultural. The classic rabbinic work known as the Talmud does the same thing when discussing Gentile chefs. Food cooked by non-Jews, it declares, bears indelible traces of non-Jewish culture. By insisting that only Jews may properly perform butchery, baking, cooking, and similar acts of food preparation, the Talmud teaches that Jewishness constitutes the ideal human culture and that Jews should remain aloof from Gentile cultures. This is why the rabbi we left in our imaginary restaurant would be ordering a salad rather than a cooked vegetarian entree. Some ancient rabbis clearly believed that following these rules about Gentile food would keep Jews from socializing with, or even worse, marrying their Gentile neighbors. Why did the sages see fit to prohibit bread, one exclaimed? Because of marriage. In other words, if we break bread with them, we're at risk of sleeping with them. Some rabbis purchased beer at the local pub but insisted on takeout or home delivery. If they drank at the pub, they might become too familiar with the Gentile patrons or their daughters. The Talmud goes so far as to forbid Jews from attending Gentile wedding celebrations, even if they bring their own food. The very act of sharing a meal with Gentiles was seen by some rabbis as fraught with danger. Other rabbis, however, were perfectly comfortable with the prospect of food-related interaction between Jews and Gentiles. Remember, the Talmud, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Meat cooked by Gentiles is forbidden, these rabbis taught, but if a Gentile neighbor helpfully flips a Jew's steak on the grill, that's okay. Bread baked by Gentiles is forbidden, but if a Jew puts the loaf into the oven, then it's permitted even if a Gentile prepared the dough. The Talmud discusses at length what a Jew must do when drinking wine with a Gentile to ensure that the Gentile doesn't offer any of that wine in libation to his gods. But the Talmud raises no concern about the fact that a Jew and a Gentile are drinking together in the first place. The rabbis responsible for these discussions, unlike their segregationist colleagues, seem to feel that the very act of taking precautions when eating with Gentiles is sufficient to reinforce a distinctive Jewish identity. Just as Israelites who choose kosher meat are reminded that God has chosen them, Rabbinic Jews who are careful with the food of Gentiles remember that God has distinguished Israel from the nations. The difference between Jews and non-Jews matters, regardless of how these rabbis define Jewishness, and in one way or another, food reinforces that distinction. As I mentioned earlier, the rabbis of the Talmud are obsessed with categories and principles. The principle underlying rabbinic discussions about the food of foreigners is simply that they are not us. Jews, not Gentiles, keep kosher. Jews, not Gentiles, worship God properly. Jews, not Gentiles, were chosen by God and live in the manner that God ordained. More fundamentally, the rabbis are convinced that Jewish law is worthy of intense consideration, while Gentile ideas are not. To cite only one example, Talmudic rabbis never bother to address the fact that Christians and Zoroastrians don't offer wine libations to Greek gods. In the binary system of classification which the rabbis inherit from their Judean predecessors, and indirectly from the Greeks, Jews constitute the one, and Gentiles are 0, an absence of significance. Prohibitions of Gentile food reinforce the distinction between Jews, who are truly important to God, and Gentiles, who just don't matter. Some rabbis take further steps to limit food-related interaction, while others rely on the laws themselves to convey the message that Jews shouldn't become too close with their Gentile neighbors. Either way, the rabbinic definition of Gentiles as literally non-Jews expresses the notion that the people of Israel is a uniquely holy nation, distinct from all others. You might think that the rabbinic approach to classifying humanity is commonplace. Of course, people divide the world between us and them and see themselves as special. This is true. But Christian and Islamic authorities developed more complex ways of classifying foreigners. These added complexities, often expressed through rules about food, reflect the distinct ways in which medieval Christians and Muslims viewed both themselves and those who follow different religions. It's a truism nowadays to say that Jesus and his first followers were all Jewish. What most people fail to realize is that Jesus, a good Jewish boy from Judea, observed Judean norms about food. Not only did Jesus keep kosher, he refused to eat with Gentiles, and in one incident, compares Gentiles to dogs unfit to sit at the table of God's Jewish children. Many of his followers, however, believed that Jesus' death and resurrection signaled the beginning of a new era in which Jews and Gentiles alike could attain salvation through faith in Christ. Paul, among others, declared that Greeks could join the church without first committing themselves to Jewish practices like circumcision and keeping kosher. Paul also insisted that Jews and Greeks participate as equals in the shared meals that defined the early Christian community. In fact, the very act of eating together established Christianity as a religion that supersedes the particular identities of Jews and Greeks. For several centuries after Jesus' death, Christian food practices served not only to bridge the gap between believers of different ethnic backgrounds, but also to distinguish those Christians from both Jews and Greeks. Unlike Jews, Christians rejected biblical food restrictions. They interpreted the Torah's laws as allegorical lessons in morality and ridiculed Jews for following them literally. They believed, for example, that God never wanted anyone to actually abstain from pork. God's true message was simply that humans shouldn't act like pigs. Alexandrian Jews, in contrast, believed that God forbade not only acting like pigs, but eating them too. Christians did not, however, eat all kinds of food. Unlike Greeks, Christians refused to eat food offered to idols. Abstention from such food was such an important part of early Christian identity that when Roman emperors required their subjects to offer sacrifices, many Christians chose to become martyrs rather than comply. With the Christianization of Rome, however, the distinction between Christians and Greeks disappeared. The distinction between Christians and Jews persisted, and if anything, became even more significant. Christians, like Jews, defined run-of-the-mill foreigners as insignificant, and they devoted minimal attention to pagans. Christians saw Jews, however, as deeply threatening. After all, both Jews and Christians laid claim to the same God and the same biblical texts, but Jews understood God in the Bible very differently from Christians. Not only that, Jews and Christians alike claimed to be the spiritual heirs of the biblical people of Israel, the uniquely holy nation. When holiness is defined in zero-sum terms, Judaism must be wrong for Christianity to be right. By ascribing negative characteristics to the Jews, Christian authorities were able to reinforce the message that contemporary Jews had forfeited to Christians the unique relationship with God established in the Bible. Leaders of the church, therefore, defined Jews not merely as non-Christians, but as anti-Christians, the polar opposite of the truly holy people. If Christians are one, Jews are negative one, even as other non-Christians are just zero. So, for example, early medieval laws expressed the notion that Jews not only fail to act in accord with Christian charity, but actively seek to harm Christians. Jews don't merely engage in sex, they seek illicit sex with unwitting nuns. Pagans simply lack knowledge of Christ, but Jews stubbornly reject such knowledge even after their nominal conversion to Christianity. On the flip side of the same coin, Christians defined themselves as anti-Jews, and they used rules about food to express this self-definition. Even though Christians may eat all food, regardless of the prohibitions found in the Torah, from the 4th century into modern times, they were not allowed to eat Jewish food or to eat with Jews. Prohibitions against shared meals with Jews reflect concern that Jews, like Christian heretics, will lead the faithful astray through their false interpretations of the Bible and God's will. Prohibitions of food prepared by Jews, meanwhile, compare that food unfavorably to meat offered to idols. Church leaders offered especially harsh polemics against Passover matzah, which they portrayed as the diabolical inverse of the communion wafer consecrated during Mass. They are, after all, both unleavened bread. But they mean absolutely opposite things, at least according to the Christians. The rhetoric associated with prohibitions of Jewish food paints a picture of Jews as both pagans and heretics, The ultimate outsiders and insiders gone horribly bad, all rolled into one terrifying image of everything Christianity condemns. By forbidding foods tainted by Jewishness, Christian authorities sought to protect their followers from succumbing to Jewish characteristics. Just as humans should not act like pigs, Christians should not act like Jews, and as a precautionary measure, shouldn't eat Jewish foods either. This is why the priests in our imaginary restaurant would refuse food prepared by Jewish cooks and insist on eating at a separate table from the rabbi. The need to create a negative image of them is crucial to many attempts to define us. Again, note the contemporary resonance. During the Middle Ages, Jewish and Christian authorities alike imagined foreigners in ways that those foreigners themselves wouldn't recognize. The common need to imagine foreigners, however, in no way determines the nature of the resulting image. The choice by Jewish authorities to imagine Gentiles as insignificant, and the choice by Christian authorities to imagine Jews as gravely dangerous, are both just that, choices. These choices reflect the ways in which religious authorities imagine the identity of their own community, and more specifically, the ways in which they stake their own claim to holiness, to being special. Islamic authorities make still different choices about the way they portray foreigners, reflecting a different set of ideas about identity and holiness. Unlike the Torah, which asserts that God chose Israel alone to be God's holy nation, the Quran teaches that all humanity is equally capable of attaining the holiness that comes from being in relationship with God. As a result, Islamic authorities don't define adherents of other religions simply as not us or anti-us, the paradigms used by Jews and Christians. Instead, Islamic sources imagine outsiders to be like us and unlike us to varying degrees. To return to our numerical spectrum, which assigns insiders the value of 1, Jewish authorities define Gentiles as 0, Christian authorities define Jews as -1, and the Quran assigns Jews and Christians alike a value less than 1, but greater than 0. This system of classification enables Muslims to define Islam itself as similar to Judaism and Christianity. All three religions stem from authentic revelations, with Islam being the latest and greatest of the three. Islamic law makes manifest the inferiority of non-Muslims by imposing special taxes and a variety of discriminatory regulations, many of which, by the way, were also imposed on religious minorities by Christian rulers. One of the primary ways in which the Quran nevertheless elevates Judaism and Christianity over other religions is by declaring that, quote, the food of those who were given the book is permitted to you. The Quran portrays the Bible as an authentic divine revelation and recognizes Judaism and Christianity as legitimate, even while proclaiming Islam itself to be the greatest of the three Abrahamic religions. In the same verse, the Quran also permits Muslim men to marry Jewish and Christian women. The reverse, marriage of a Muslim woman to a Jewish or Christian man, isn't okay because traditional wifely subservience would result in a Muslim being inferior to a non-Muslim. Make no mistake, neither Muslims nor anyone else in the Middle Ages embraced our contemporary notions of pluralism. Muslims were, however, more inclined than Jews and Christians to see the world in shades of gray. This is particularly true of Sunnis, the numerically and politically dominant of Islam's two major branches. Medieval Sunni authorities highlight the permissibility of meat prepared by Jewish and Christian butchers as a means of emphasizing the fact that all recipients of God's revelations are alike in certain respects. This is why the Sunni imam in our imaginary restaurant would happily eat with the rabbi and the priest, sharing any food prepared in accordance with Jewish norms, although Christian norms are more problematic. Sunni Islam teaches that popular consensus is a source of authoritative information about God's will. And the legitimacy granted to Judaism and Christianity serves to enlarge the circle of those who agree on certain fundamental principles of Islam. By asserting that even Jews and Christians have knowledge of God's will, Sunnis also bolster their claim that all Muslims have access to such knowledge. This claim is key to Sunni arguments against Shi'ism, the smaller branch of Islam. Sunnis contend that because most Muslims are Sunnis, their consensus opinion demonstrates that Sunni Islam must be right. Majority rules. Notice that Sunnis use food practices and rhetoric about Jews and Christians to advance their claim in a purely internal Islamic dispute. Shi'i authorities also used food practices and rhetoric about Jews and Christians in order to advance their particular way of viewing Islam. Unlike their Sunni counterparts, whose permission of Jewish and Christian food affirms the similarities among the Abrahamic traditions, medieval Shi'is stressed the differences between Islam and its predecessors. Attacking the symbolically significant permission of Jewish and Christian food, Shi'i authorities declare that Jewish and Christian butchers are incapable of properly invoking God when slaughtering animals. Why? Because of their incorrect theologies. After all, if they understood God properly, they'd be Muslims. Shi'is also assert that all non-Muslims are impure and transmit impurity through contact. That's why the Shi'i in our imaginary restaurant would not only insist on an undressed salad, raw vegetables can't become impure, but would also avoid sitting next to non-Muslims. Shi'is criticize Sunnis for their willingness to eat the food of Jews and Christians. They pointed to this practice as proof that Sunnis fail to understand God's will and aren't in fact good Muslims. This critique reflects the Shi'i belief that true knowledge of God is not accessible to all Muslims, let alone to non-Muslims. Rather, such knowledge comes only through the teachings of Muhammad's descendants, the Shi'i Imams. Shi'is used rhetoric about Jews and Christians to disparage Sunnis, much as Republicans in Congress used rhetoric about freedom fries to disparage Democrats, who, like the French, were reluctant to support the 2003 Iraq War. By implication, those French fry-eating Democrats don't value freedom and aren't truly American. What's at stake in medieval rhetoric about religious foreigners and their food, and at some level in contemporary political rhetoric as well, is nothing less than the self-identity espoused by those who spoke for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps for what it means to be American. Shi'is imagine themselves as the sole community with true knowledge of God's will. So they regarded Jews and Christians as unlike us and impure. Sunnis imagine themselves at the top of a hierarchy that includes adherents of other traditions. So they imagined Jews and Christians as like us and legitimate. Christians imagine themselves in implacable opposition to the Jews, the false claimants to the mantle of biblical Israel. So they saw Jews as anti-us and demonic. Jews, meanwhile, imagine themselves as utterly aloof from their surroundings, as God's holy nation regardless of their lowly status in this world. For that reason, they insisted that Gentiles are simply not us and not relevant. These ways of understanding the relationship between us and them became so deeply enmeshed with fundamental conceptions of self-identity that medieval authorities in all three traditions bent over backwards to preserve them, even in the face of evidence that followers of other religions don't in fact conform to stereotype. So, for example, Sunnis went to great length to justify the permission of Christian food, despite the fact that Christians don't actually follow the dietary laws laid out in the Quran. Christians, meanwhile, made a point of eating distinctively Christian foods, especially pork, and avoided food associated with Jews. Christians even began to avoid food associated with Muslims on the grounds that Muslims Judaize, quote unquote, through their adherence to dietary laws. Medieval Jews, meanwhile, doubled down on their prohibition of Gentile wine, even though they knew that Christians and Muslims don't offer idolatrous wine libations. They settled on the argument that drinking Gentile wine might lead to marrying Gentile women. What mattered most to medieval rabbis wasn't the rationale behind their food restrictions, but rather the fact that these rules reinforce a sense of Jewish distinctiveness. Monotheism may no longer set Jews apart from their neighbors, but food practices will still do the trick. Modern forms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam differ from their medieval counterparts in a number of significant respects. These include the ways in which each religion's leadership defines its collective identity and portrays the relationship between us and them. Food practices remain a valuable barometer for tracing these ideas, and they highlight the radical transformations that have occurred in all three Abrahamic traditions over the past century or so. Many Muslims continue to emphasize the ways in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews are alike. A number of college campuses, for example, feature joint kosher halal kitchens in which Jews and Muslims prepare and share meals together, and in the process, learn how to respect one another's beliefs and practices. Some Sunni hardliners, however, now forbid meat prepared by Jews and Christians, despite the fact that the Quran itself explicitly permits such behavior. Such prohibitions first emerged under colonial rule as a means of passive resistance to European Christian imperialism. They still sometimes reflect anti-Zionist sentiments. There is, however, another important factor that motivates those who seek to limit Muslim consumption of Jewish and Christian food. These Muslims justify their prohibitions by arguing that contemporary Jews and Christians no longer really believe God's revelations. They've become too secular. This assertion bolsters the efforts of hardliners to resist incorporating certain aspects of Western culture into Islamic life. The condemnation of Jewish and Christian food serves as a proxy for condemning the ways in which Judaism and Christianity themselves have evolved in response to the modern world. True Muslims, they teach, must be unlike Christians and Jews in this fundamental respect. Jewish hardliners as well insist that contemporary Jews should not eat food prepared by Gentiles, albeit for somewhat different reasons than their Muslim counterparts. Stores that cater to Orthodox communities stock milk certified as prepared by Jews, cheese certified as Jewish-made, processed food certified as having been cooked by Jews, and bread labeled baked by Jews. Labels like these convey the message that truly pious Jews need to remain aloof from American society, and they need to live in communities of like-minded Jews in order to do so easily. You will not find any of those labels at your nearest Shaw's or Hanover. These rules, not coincidentally, also make it very difficult for the Jews who follow them to eat with the many Jews who don't. Liberal forms of Judaism pose a particular threat to those who insist upon what they call Torah-true Judaism. Keeping kosher in some Jewish circles now means keeping separate from less traditional Jews. Some ultra-Orthodox authorities go even further, forbidding Jews from attending Gentile celebrations and even from eating kosher Jewish-made food at the same table as Gentiles. These rabbis blame casual social interactions like office holiday parties for the high rate of mixed marriages in America. And they insist that Jewish distinctiveness requires a complete separation from Gentiles in situations involving food. Blanket prohibitions against eating with Gentiles are unprecedented, but their spirit is entirely in keeping with the attitude of Hellenistic Judeans. Food associated with Gentiles poses a dire threat to Jewish identity. Most American Jews, in contrast, are akin to their Alexandrian ancestors, who sought to maintain a distinctive Jewish identity without, in the process, cutting themselves off from the society around them. As a prominent liberal rabbi puts it in a ruling allowing Jews to drink wine prepared by Gentiles, quote, short of mixed marriage, Jews should have social and business contact with non-Jews. The ease with which Jews interact with Gentiles today is evident both in the ubiquity of shared meals and also in the high rate of intermarriage. While many American Jews remain concerned about the long-term impact of such marriages on Jewish continuity, hardly any are willing to sever all social ties with non-Jews. After all, most Jews regard their non-Jewish neighbors, colleagues, and friends as like us, rather than simply and generically not us. The desire for interaction across religious lines, moreover, is now mutual, as most Christians today also view Jews as like us. The 20th century transformation in Christian attitudes toward Jews ranks among the most radical changes within Christianity during modern times. As late as the 19th century, popes were still instructing the faithful never to eat with Jews. Influential Protestants, meanwhile, penned anti-Semitic tracts about the Jewish threat to Christian societies. After the Holocaust, however, both Catholic and Protestant leaders revised their traditional attitudes toward Judaism. Now, instead of teaching that Jews are anti-Christians, official Catholic doctrine is that Jews are like Christians. Far from condemning matzah and other Jewish foods, many Christians today seek out opportunities to attend Passover Seders, often in the hopes of better understanding Jesus. The transformation in Christian teachings about the Jews was accompanied in the US by another even more significant development, namely the rise of an American civic religion defined as Judeo-Christian. Much as early Christianity superseded the older ethnic identities of Jews and Greeks, American identity has largely superseded the religious identities of most Jews and Christians alike. In both cases, the result is increased interaction, both food-related and otherwise, and the downplaying of differences. Priest, minister, rabbi jokes emerged during World War II, when Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish chaplains served and died side by side. It remains unclear to what extent imams will be invited to join in on the joke and to take part as equals in American culture. It's also still unclear how Jewish, Christian, and Muslim identity will evolve in the American context. The ideal of the melting pot, in which ethnic and religious distinctions disappear, is increasingly challenged by the much more palatable ideal of a salad bowl. Many of us value vibrant distinctiveness, both our own and that of our neighbors. Just look at the popularity of ethnic cuisine. A major challenge facing Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike is finding ways to define our identities that don't resort to distorted images of those who belong to other faith traditions. After all, stereotyped ideas about them, rather than the ideas of others about themselves, continue to play an outsized role in interreligious dialogue and contemporary theology. Matters are even worse in the mass media and online, especially when it comes to ideas about Muslims. The result, of course, is mutual misunderstanding, a Babel-like situation in which collaborative construction efforts are severely hobbled, if not doomed to failure. At the beginning of this talk, I left a priest, a minister, a rabbi, and an imam sitting in a restaurant. Such a cordial interfaith gathering would have been inconceivable until quite recently. The message I would emphasize to those committed to pluralism and constructive collaboration is that we need to pay greater attention to the different ways in which religious communities imagine themselves, and for that matter, the different ways in which all communities imagine themselves. True relationships entail perceiving the other not in terms of our own preconceptions and interests, but rather in terms of the other's self-definition. To see others as others see themselves, however, may require significant changes in the ways in which we imagine our own distinctive identities. Thank you.
If you have any questions, please seek the microphone. We have 2 microphones. One on.
And we have a question in back here.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for everything you just said. That was really a great kind of set of remarks that you brought. I'm wondering, in the case of how you were talking about, in the wake of the Holocaust, the revision of Christian, both Catholic and Protestant, rules or opinions on sharing with Jews and kind of a sympathy emerging for Jews, insofar as that relates to Islam and the current climate of persecution that Muslims are experiencing in this country, I'm wondering if, when you talk about self-examination and seeing people as they see themselves instead of taking the rhetoric of an outside perspective of us and them, are you hopeful or fearful that it would take more persecution in order for the sympathetic perspective to be adopted by Jews and Christians? Or can dialogue legitimately foster that mutual understanding that you were talking about without disaster striking beforehand?
To paraphrase, do Muslims need a Holocaust before we can tolerate them? My answer is no, they don't. I certainly hope we don't take that route. But I don't think that that's necessary to reach that goal. There already were efforts within Catholic and Protestant circles to reimagine Jews before the Holocaust. Some were inspired by the rise of Nazism, but others were happening independently. We're seeing today a lot of interest in reevaluating from a theological perspective Christian conceptions of Muslims. In some ways, out of a sense that we don't want to get to a point where another Holocaust or genocide or catastrophe would occur. I think that, as human beings, we're able to learn a lesson from one context and apply it to another one. There is, however, an important difference that we need to bear in mind. If we think back to the Second Vatican Council, just to pick on the Catholics because it's the easiest, they're the most organized, and so they speak with one voice. Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965 fundamentally reimagines how the Catholic Church relates to the world, to the Protestants, to the Jews, to other non-Christian communities, and they make those distinctions very clear in their writings. And so, for example, in the aftermath of Vatican II, the Vatican establishes new rubrics for engaging in interfaith dialogue. And the dialogue with Muslims happens as part of, I believe it's called the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Relations. It's what you'd expect it to be. Relations with the Jews happen within the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity. Right, so Jews are being imagined in a fundamentally different way than Muslims are. They've become like us from a Catholic perspective. They're honorary Christians. They're kind of like the Protestants. They don't quite get it, but they're at least on the same ballpark. Right? Muslims aren't in that ballpark from the Vatican II Catholic perspective. And I think that one of the challenges that faces not only Catholics but also Protestants, frankly Jews within their own framework, these traditions have for so long defined Islam as being outside the pale that they have a hard time coming up with ways of bringing Muslims into the pale. The concept of the Abrahamic religions is one of the prominent ways in which they're trying to do just that, but it's a struggle. Religions are deeply rooted in tradition, and that makes change challenging under the best of circumstances.
Here you go.
On a trip we took to Israel 5 years ago, the guide spent a lot of time talking about the establishment of Tel Aviv and that there was a formal rejection of Eastern European foods and adoption of Palestinian foods. You want to comment on that with your talk?
Sure. Not quite related to the themes that I addressed, but it does get to that core question of how do we construct an identity? Right? And the Zionists who moved to Israel were very conscious, I should say Palestine at the time, it wasn't yet the state of Israel, very much imagined themselves as being new Jews, rejecting the old diaspora Jew, the kind of Jew who ate gefilte fish and matzah balls and all of that kind of mushy stuff. Right? No, we are strong. We eat falafel. Right? And precisely by eating falafel rather than matzah balls, we're demonstrating that we have made a fundamental break from our past. We are new, or in fact, they would say, we are returning to our old past. We are the original Palestinians, and we're going to learn from our Palestinian neighbors how Palestinians really eat, how Palestinians really live. Right? It's a constructed identity, but all identities are constructed. And the ways in which different communities construct those identities, new Jews as opposed to old Jews, as opposed to older Jews, or Jews as opposed to Christians, or Catholics as opposed to Protestants, all the rest of that, all of these are attempts to create a sense of identity that provides both purpose and direction in life, and a sense, in some ways, if not that I'm better than everybody else, at least that I'm just as good as everybody else. And how that plays out can often be seen in terms of food and the history of Israeli food, and frankly, the debates over who owns falafel. Right? Palestinians claim Israelis shouldn't count that as an Israeli food. It's a Palestinian food. It's an Arab food. Well, of course it is. It's all of that. Right? But the food becomes that marker of the identity conflict.
From my perspective as a secular outsider, the food practices of Jews and Muslims seem much more similar to each other than they do to Christians. E.g., neither group eats pork, they both have flatbreads, etc. And in my upbringing as a liberal Protestant, I don't remember hearing any, and the third similarity is just all these rules about what you're supposed to eat and not eat. When I was young and raised as a liberal Protestant, I don't remember, frankly, hearing any rules about forbidden foods and drinks and so forth. Do you think that's basically correct? And if so, why don't these two groups get along better with each other, given the similarities between their food practices?
We know full well that similar people don't always get along. In some ways, the closer you are, the more tension there might be. The Jews and Muslims have gotten along tremendously well at certain times in history, and not so well at other times in history. So I think the degree of conflict and coexistence doesn't have anything to do with the fundamental similarities or differences between different communities. Similarly, Jews and Christians have gotten along very well at times, very horribly at other times. And that doesn't have to do with the fact that Jews and Christians were more similar at one time, more different at another time. There are different factors involved. But to get back to your initial observation, absolutely. Jewish and Islamic food practices are quite similar. One of the reasons for that similarity, right, you talked about flat bread. Well, that's a Middle Eastern style of food. Right? So food preparation technology, available ingredients, the fact that pigs don't do too well in the kind of arid environments that characterize the land of Israel, Palestine, that characterize the Arabian Peninsula. They do very well in Greece. Right? So you can actually mark the differences in cultural acceptance of certain foods based on factors that have nothing to do with culture, that have to do with geography and ecology and all the rest of that. Christians in the Middle East, for a long time, in fact, slaughtered animals in exactly the same way that Jews and Muslims did. They ate pork, and they made a point of eating pork to show that they're Christians, not Muslims and Jews. But the meat in the butcher shops would otherwise be pretty similar. So we have a variety of different practices going on. They can be used to establish a similarity, right, as Muslims assume that Jews are eating basically the same food so we can eat their food. And they even assume that about Christians because those who originated the texts wrote in the Middle East, and the Christians they knew observed these rules. Christians in Europe didn't, so when they discovered those, they had another issue. But also rules about food can be used, can be mobilized to create distinctions. And so, in fact, there are examples within liberal Protestant circles about Wonder Bread as a distinctly Protestant food. Right? The things that we often take for granted as just being American foods are often foods that began with particular ethnic or religious connotations, and they've changed over time. Right? Bagels are no longer a Jewish food. They're an American food. Wonder Bread is no longer a Protestant food. It's an American food. Pizza, well, hasn't quite made that jump yet into American culture.
Question here.
Yes, in terms of the interaction between Muslims and Jews and Christians, I think we need to also see it from within the perspective of the Muslims, who, although they acknowledge the other peoples of the book, are quite insistent on their inferior status. It is true that if you compare the historical experience of Jews with Christians down through the ages, and the experience of Jews with Muslims, Jews have generally done better with Muslims. But before we get too kumbaya about that, you've got to understand that always, that tolerance by Muslims, that's what it was and is, tolerance, is based on the absolute supremacy in matters of power politics of the Muslims. And one final point, in the situation of the world today, the situation that Muslims find themselves in, the problem that they have is with other Muslims. It's Muslims who are killing other Muslims, not because Christians and Jews are on the warpath against Muslims. That needs to be understood. Final word, Christianity in the 17th century had its Westphalia moment when not through any kind of moral epiphany, but through understanding of practical realities, the leadership class in the Western world realized that it was a bad idea to use state force to enforce religious conformity. So much so that today we can hardly imagine doing that. Of course, Christians found other ways of doing terrible things with other people in the 20th century, as we know, but at least not on the basis of religion. Islam has not yet had its Westphalia moment. And there is still an element very much alive today of suprematism in Islam. We have to remember Islam is many things just as Christianity is many things. I've talked too long, but I think these ideas are worth thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you for those points. They're really important. Certainly with regard to the first one, it's absolutely crucial to understand that neither Muslims nor Christians nor Jews in the Middle Ages had anything resembling our conception of tolerance. Each community was fundamentally convinced that God chose them alone, that God preferred them over all other peoples. Those who happened to be in positions of political power pointed to that power as proof that God loved them most, and those who were unfortunate enough not to be in power pointed to their powerlessness to show that they truly believe. Because after all, if they really just wanted something comfortable in life, they'd convert to the dominant religion. But see, we show how much we love God by accepting persecution as a minority. One way or another, the message was consistently, we're better than the rest of you, we're right, you're wrong. There is still very much that notion of our group is the best, other groups are inferior within our world today. Some define that in religious terms, some define that in national terms, in ethnic terms, in various other kinds of terms. There's something, I think, inherent to human nature, like part of that desire that we all have to feel special, that can lead us to the conclusion, in order for me to be special, I've got to be better than everybody else, or at least better than you. Right? We know that that's a reality. There has been tremendous change within Christianity. You point to the Westphalia moment as one organized instance of that. There's been tremendous change within Judaism. There's been tremendous change within Islam. And the point that you make about Islam not being a unified thing, there are lots of different Muslim views, including about whether one can imagine a world in which multiple communities can be right, in which pluralism is not just tactical or by necessity, but in fact strategic and desired. There are absolutely Muslims today who share those same principles, just as there are absolutely Muslims today who vehemently and violently reject them. And the very fact that we're seeing so much conflict within the Muslim world testifies to that diversity on the ground.
We have a question right in the center here.
Thank you, David. Great talk. You dealt specifically with what I would call meat in terms of the issue of separation of food. There are whole elements within, at least within Jewish religious law, that deal with things like seafood, separation of milk and meat. How does that fit into some of the things that you're talking about?
Fundamentally, I think, well, certainly the seafood is simply another variation on the meat issue, right? We eat certain kinds of food, and that separates us. Well, that potentially is simply a matter of these are the foods that we think are okay, right? Biblically, the conception, remember, most of the biblical Israelites lived in the hill country. They'd never seen the Mediterranean, probably haven't seen a fish, but they have a conception of what a fish looks like. Right? Fish have fins and scales. If it looks like a fish, it's a fish. If it doesn't look like a fish, I don't know what that lobster thing is. Right? And so that probably has something to do with the biblical origins of seafood rules, although nobody's quite sure because there's so little evidence about Israelite attitudes toward seafood because they didn't live by the sea. Once you get into later traditions, the notion that we've got to be careful about the seafood that those other people sell because it might be adulterated. Right? That can labeled tuna fish may not be tuna fish. Becomes part of that, can we really trust the outside world? Or do we need to only trust ourselves? It's interesting, actually, the comment earlier about similarities between Jewish and Islamic food practices. The Quran says nothing about permitted and forbidden fish. But there are plenty of Islamic traditions about what fish is or is not permitted. And they often resemble Jewish attitudes, probably, again, because of that Near Eastern conception of what counts as fish and what's just weird. Right? We all have that. There are absolutely foods in this world, like horse meat, dog meat, that are alien to our culture. And even the Protestant who feels they can eat anything, I'm sure your mother didn't like the idea of you having cat for dinner, right? We just take these for granted. And at some level, some of these distinctions are simply a matter of, what it means to be human, right? When we teach our kids, no, Jacob, we don't eat frogs, right? That's probably to a kid who's playing in the swamp, right? On the other hand, if you're a Brit, to say, no, Jacob, we don't eat frogs, unlike those French over there who eat frog legs, right? Well, there you go, absolutely, right? You can use these, right? Food rules have the potential to convey identity and convey meaning. They don't always do so. But when it's in the interests of a parent, when it's in the interests of a community leader, when it's in the interests of a political ideologue, to establish divisions between my group and some other group, food is often used as a way to do just that.
With these final comments, thank you. We thank you so much for attending, and I'll probably see you again in the next lecture. Thank you.